There was no evidence that Mr. Noriega was involved in drugs, no hard evidence until we indicted him.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system.
Oh, we don't mess around other people's elections,
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Rackets Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Std. Often I cover topics such as organized crime, crony capitalism, corrupt politics, things of that nature, things that are truly rackets. But tonight we're going to talk about a different topic, prostitution. And in many people's eyes, they view that as a racket. But I make the argument that it actually should be decriminalized. And really, I've got the perfect guest on the show tonight. Her name is Dame Catherine Healy. She's the founder of the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. In fact, she was awarded the title of Dame this year by Queen Elizabeth II. And that was in large part due to her activism and on behalf of sex workers, and in large part due to her efforts for decriminalizing prostitution in New Zealand back in 2003. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian, and hello to everyone. I hope you can follow what I say and the accent. Yeah, indeed, we did decriminalise sex work in New Zealand, as we prefer to call it, and that was in 2003. After 15 years of pushing for this change, we scraped through. We have a parliamentary system, and we managed to get through by one vote in the parliament, which makes the laws that govern the whole country. But our history, we started as sex workers in 1987, and we had all sorts of issues, as many sex worker organisations around the world could relate to, and I'm sure people in the US who are organising as sex workers know what it's like. You're a sex worker and the police are looming rather large in your life. So we had those sorts of conditions, and we had a concern as well back then, as today, about keeping ourselves safe, having access to labour law, making sure that we could stand up and have instruments available to us to use in mediation, and also concern about HIV awareness and prevention around STIs and so on. And of course, all of that was difficult for us because it was against the law to do practically anything. We could be a sex worker, we just couldn't ask for money for sex, soliciting. So we'd frequently be visited by the police, and we'd be checked up on, and our names would be taken. I worked in a massage parlour. I also started sex work in the late 70s for a small period on the street, but went back to sex work in the mid-1980s. So, we had a lot of pressing issues, and that galvanised us. It's fair to say HIV was really a big thing, as well as the police and lack of labour protections. So we started, and we set up a newsletter. They'd call it a zine today. It was one of those things that we dropped around and through the underground networks and so on to sex workers. And then the ministry, or the Department of Health as it was called at the time, approached us and asked if we would enter into a formal agreement with the Minister of Health. And we reflected on this because we felt it was really important to keep our point of view and our beating heart, around rights, and not to become a kind of service provider with no energy for changing things, just taking orders from government. So we said to government at the time that we wanted to keep our identity and not be scripted, and that we would design the appropriate responses and support for sex workers. And in fact, that all came to pass. But it became obvious too that there was a very strong tension between government agencies. So while on the one hand, we were able to get a condom distribution scheme going throughout the massage parlours and escort agencies, as they were called then. On the other hand, the police would come in undercover posing as our clients, and these same condoms would be the evidence that would be produced to achieve convictions against us. So we threw our toys out of the cot and said we cannot have this, this unbearable tension, and we needed for government to review the legislation. We're quite modest in our requests because you want to be realistic, you want to keep engaged.
Sure.
And so that began our process really, and off we went, building support to get that law changed 2003. So, I can sit here now and reflect on 31 years and, half and half really when it was illegal, and now as an ex-sex worker, I listen to sex workers talking about the reality of working in a decriminalised environment. And, it's really interesting because the relationships with the police, who loomed large and were sometimes, definitely not with us. They were definitely working against us. All of that's changed, and on Monday we mark the occasion of International Day to End Violence against sex workers by releasing with the police a document that we've produced together that is about the prevention of sexual violence for sex workers.
That's a lot to unwrap there. One of the first things that I think, for a US-based audience that probably stuck out, the fact that the government reached out to your organization to help an HIV outreach program. It's entirely different here in the US. I'm sure that you've heard of the Anti-Prostitution Pledge, but maybe you're not familiar with the politics behind it. This was an initiative by the George W. Bush administration back in 2003. Our U.S. aid program essentially made this rule that any NGO group that does any sort of HIV prevention work has to have an explicit, or has to sign an anti-prostitution pledge. In other words, they can't condone it in any way. And the person who is responsible for that program was a guy named Randall Tobias. And a few years later, his name actually surfaced in a scandal involving the DC Madam. So in other words, he was an actual client of a very popular madam there in Washington, DC. This is the guy who is responsible for pushing that pledge. Coincidentally, that pledge went in place.
Certainly. No, certainly. We're fully aware of this irony, and it's impacted on sex worker communities all around. The fact that you can't acknowledge sex workers' work and receive funding from that president's initiative is striking, really. It's a very difficult situation. We're, on the other hand, very free. So, I do know that when I visit the States, there's this visa application we have to go through, and it's about, have you been involved in moral turpitude? And, the question about whether you've been involved in prostitution. So, I like to think I've been involved in sex work. So it's
right. Exactly. Well, again, it's sort of this moralistic policy, and I just kind of find it very interesting because in the same year that your country is going to, in my mind, a move towards progress and an evidence-based approach is the same exact year that our country put in this anti-prostitution pledge. And basically, you know, the whole world health community railed against this. You know, every organization from the UN, the World Health Organization, has openly criticized it because, I mean, this really is, it's a life or death kind of policy. But it's something that was pushed in the U.S. basically just as sort of like a PR move. It's just a political decision. But again, at the end of the day, a lot of times people might view this as an issue that's, you know, not very high on the totem pole. But again, this actually really is a life or death issue. The kind of work that you've done and other outreach workers have done, it's very important that, you know, that these health officials and outreach workers, you know, can talk to sex workers, give them information, provide them. I particularly found the example that you were talking about interesting when you were mentioning that you're passing out these condoms and then the police are going along and confiscating them. You know, we have the exact same issue here in the U.S. There are a few cities that have started to ban police from using condoms as evidence just because, you know, the obvious, you know, health consequences, but it's still very much an issue.
And it's a tremendous barrier to reporting. We note, you know, with evidence-based research on 773 sex workers and subsequent research since then. We've recently had someone from America come and do some research into violence and exploitation in the context of decriminalization. But we note that, you know, the barriers to reporting to the police are removed a lot, not entirely, because you still sort of, you know, have a bit of anxiety about fronting up to report things to any authority. But nevertheless, you know, there's a willingness on the side of the police to make sure there are as few barriers as possible for sex workers to come forward to report if there are difficulties or you know, issues related to coercion or violence, etc. And, you know, the trafficking discourse, while we have it in our country, it's compounded if it's conflated with sex work. And I know that perhaps in the US these two things are conflated. So people
Very much so.
Prostitution,
yeah, very much so.
Trafficking, same. And it's really important. We haven't, you know, we've managed to keep those two issues distinct from each other. So, you know, that dreadful conflation doesn't harm, you know, add to the harm that's caused by criminalisation. So, you know, yeah, I mean, it would be very difficult to find even, you know, the anti-lobby here now couch their phrases like, you know, they sort of say things like, look, you know, we note that we've got some sex workers working outside our houses on the inner city and there's no zoning legislation. There's nothing we can do to stop them. But we don't want to change the laws around prostitution, they'll say. We just want them to pipe down at night, not to be so noisy. And how can we make that work, you know? And so every now and again there's this kind of discussion about some areas related to sex workers. But for the most part, you get people saying, we don't want to change the laws and go backwards. And that's good. We have had attempts and we've had a serious review in Parliament where we prefer to call it the Swedish model because that's, you know, where it implies other countries around Sweden are in favour of what's sometimes referred to as the Nordic model, and they're not necessarily. Denmark, for example, isn't in favour of what Sweden's done with its approach to sex workers, which is to criminalise third parties, you know, like the clients are arrested and you can't have a manager of a brothel as we can here. But we've had a serious look at this in New Zealand, and quite rightly the parliamentarians, the lawmakers said no, it's not for our country. We prefer, you know, total decriminalisation where sex work is, and as sex workers we're embedded, we're treated just the same as any other occupational group. sometimes, and they you know, like they say, oh, we should have inspectors coming around to check up on the sex workers, and I find that really offensive because, you know, you have an inspectorate when you need it. For example, if you have a problem and a brothel's too cold, or if a brothel operator is being exploitative, you can do something about that in the same way that you would in any other occupation or area of work. You look up, you see whom to call, and, you know, quite often, you know, somebody will come and have a look into the situation to inspect policies and practices, just like you would in any normal workforce. Normal, I mean, too.
Yeah, I would say that for the American audience, and I can point to what I think would be, you know, pretty darn interesting examples. One of which you know better than I do, but I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago that one sex worker successfully filed what was essentially like a sexual harassment claim against a brothel owner.
It was, and it was simply that he was upsetting her by what he was saying. He didn't want to have sex with her. He was referring to her in an inappropriate sexual manner, and she said, fuck, you know, it's not his role to do that. I come to work, I like my work, I like my workmates, this brothel is okay for me, I don't like the way he talks to me. So her case was picked up. We supported her as an organisation through the Human Rights Review Tribunal. He was held to account for being harassing her, as well as sexually harassing her verbally, and he was fined approximately 12,000, maybe 10,000 US dollars, 25,000 Kiwi dollars, and he was ordered to do sexual harassment training, and that, you know, that was a good outcome. And just that's a tiny example of, you know, just what can be done. We've had another one in respect to online bullying, where a sex worker was outed, and it was a whole set of circumstances, but nevertheless she was able to say, look, actually these things you're saying about me, she was called a walking STI and that sort of thing, and really inappropriate kind of stuff. And she said, I'm comfortable being a sex worker, etc., but yeah, I'm not comfortable with you bullying me like this online. And just things where mothers, or parents I should say, of children, or caregivers of children feel far more secure. You know, they used to worry when it was criminalised that they were not judged as fit and proper people to have children. That is something that, you know, people might carry a bit of anxiety in that regard, but overall that's not grounds at all to take a child off someone. So there's been massive changes, and we need to probably get one more change really in terms of legislation, which is protection from discrimination, because, you know, it's not all plain sailing. As a sex worker, you can still be discriminated against. So if I was a tax inspector and I went to answer an advert to share a flat, you know, a flatmate might say to me, oh, don't like tax inspectors. So I can be discriminated against if I was a tax inspector. There's no protection on the grounds of occupation, and the same exists for sex workers, but most frequently it's sex workers who are discriminated against, and we think there needs to be explicit legislation to say that you can't discriminate on the basis of someone being a sex worker. We also have hostile legislation in regards to people who come here. So if you're American thinking, I'm coming to going to get my ticket down to New Zealand tomorrow and be a sex worker, just think again, because we have on the back of anti-trafficking legislation, there was a beat up, and the Minister of Immigration at that time decided it would be appropriate to say that you couldn't come to New Zealand with the intention of being a sex worker. So that's really caused a great deal of difficulty for people who are migrants here and don't have permanent residencies, for example, students who are studying and are able to work in any other occupation but sex work. So we still have a bit more to do before we can say, look, we've created a fair and equitable situation for sex workers in this country.
So if you're a foreigner, have work papers, you can work in any profession except for the sex trade. So essentially it's just pushing a certain percentage of the industry underground, it sounds like.
Exactly, and it predictably, all of the situations related to exploitation can happen in circumstances where people feel unable to stand up for themselves. So it's an area that is strikingly different to what most sex workers in this country experience.
Right, in opposition to, say, a domestic worker. Yeah, I mean, and that's really the case with most of human trafficking. Most of it doesn't pertain to the sex industry. It's really legal work, but often it's a person who's an undocumented worker, and that's where the exploiter, they use that prohibition against them to exploit that worker. That is sad to hear that there is, obviously it's not a perfect system, and there's room for growth. I actually read about the case you were talking about with the lady who was essentially a victim of online bullying.
Yes.
It's I found that interesting. Yes, that she didn't. This woman, her husband or her ex-husband had been paying for a sex worker, so she decided to out this person publicly. There's a term, I think a lot of the young people like to call it doxing. But essentially, she chose not, instead of publicly embarrassing her husband who was cheating on her, she decided to publicly embarrass the sex worker who, but in the end, I think the jury did award her damages, correct?
They did, indeed they did. And, the judge was very considered, and it's just kind of neat to see that in very serious environments like that, the word sex worker is used and it's respectful and so on. And yeah, it was a very good outcome.
Well, and one of the things I'm kind of curious about, because I wanted to, because a lot of this does have to be sort of anecdotal. But I mean, when you look at examples like that, you can obviously see that. And again, not every sex worker who's been a victim of coercion will go forward. But obviously, at least the laws are on the books to enable a person to do that. And I like to juxtapose that with my own country here in the U.S., where in many cases, the people who are supposed to be upholding the law, our law enforcement officers, are the ones who are actually guilty of some of the worst crimes. And by that, I mean, you can look at all kinds of surveys with sex workers, and inevitably you'll always find a very high percentage of them are often victims of extortion by police officers. And in many cases, they're extorting them for free sex. There was actually one specific study by a group of economists at the University of Chicago. They call their work Freakonomics, and they do a lot of unconventional studies. And I don't remember the exact number, but I believe they found that 4% of the sex workers that they studied, that 4% of the acts are actually sex that was given for free to police officers in order to be able to stay working. And again, you mentioned a little bit about that relationship with the police, and I was just kind of hoping that you could kind of expand a little bit about that.
Just to dovetail into your, the reference to the research there, we had sex worker who had car fines, like she had problems
like speeding
driving
tickets or something
like that, yeah. Okay. But she had also had a relationship with this police officer, and he was paying her for sex, and then he kind of wanted it for free when he discovered this, that he said he had an advantage over her. And right. So she came to us, and he was prosecuted and sent to prison.
Oh, wow.
And, yeah. So, and another story, which isn't uncommon actually, it's quite a nice one. We had one of our outreach workers was out and about and with the street workers, and one of them was saying, look, this guy hasn't paid me. And so they rang the police straight away, and the police said, put me on speaker phone, and boomed at the client to pay up or he'd come down and arrest him. And another one actually was in situ, where the police officer came by, and the client standing there and emptying his pockets, saying he didn't have his wallet. And so the police officer drove him home to get the wallet to take him back to the ATM machine, the automatic, money machine.
Right.
So that sex worker was paid. And, these images, and the police will tell us too quite funny stories. They'll say, oh yeah, we were driving, we didn't realise, she was working, we parked, and they told us, oh, you're in our way, can you, move your car, please, you're blocking our business. So,
Right.
a lot of funny stories. And it's not to say everyone has a Pollyanna approach to relationships with the police. There can still be issues, like if you're in other communities, you might have issues in relation to drug use that the police know about, and drug use, as we all know, isn't decriminalised, and that can lead to quite a provocative sort of relationship. So it's just, but overall, in respect to sex work, it's a lot healthier.
Oh, yeah. And that's something I was kind of curious about. So you're telling these stories, and I think they're fairly current. But was this change of events, was it almost immediate after the laws changed? Was it a subtle shift in your eyes?
It was really kind of interesting, because the police had different reactions. And of course, it seemed to us the higher-ups were a little bit more supportive. They sort of got the bigger picture, and the people on the ground were slightly different. But we certainly had a few teething problems. So it did take a bit of a shift. And I remember, talking to somebody, a police officer, and saying, look, we've got this problem. And he was like, oh, it's your problem now, Catherine. And he was really sore, and he had deeply held religious beliefs, and he was really bitter about the law change. And so we had to go through some of that sort of stuff. But now I think, the widespread cultural response from the police is one of support. And it's just case after case after case where you get the same thing, and the researchers have dug in deep to kind of find what the issues, what the vibe is, and it seems to be consistently that the relationship is much, much better.
So, you obviously had a lot of contact with all of the, all these different politicians to make it happen. I'm kind of curious, because this is something that I find here in the U.S. I'm an outspoken proponent of decriminalization, and here in the U.S., it's almost sort of like a canned response. Society tells us that you can't say that. But once I give a person, say, a rebuttal or two, oftentimes they'll kind of quietly say, well, actually, I really don't care. I'm actually open to decriminalization. In other words, there's such a strong stigma attached to it. So I guess really my question is, that some of the politicians who were against it in the past, have you seen them actually change as well now that this stigma's out of the way?
Yes, and certainly there are people who would never believe otherwise, and they latch on and they dig in and they'll hold that line. But certainly there's been that softening, and I remember speaking to one political leader whose party had voted outright against, and he said, oh, it's funny how you see, and I had to remind him of this, because he was like, he said, oh, it's funny how you see things in retrospect. And, it was kind of his concession that what a silly position to have taken, really, so, to oppose it. But yeah, I think it's funny. Australasia, we're lucky with our near neighbours. We have New South Wales, 3 hours away by flight, Sydney, Australia, where a big population of sex workers, and it's been decriminalised there for 25 years. So, but other parts of Australia are still illegal. Well, they have a mixed kind of response. I shouldn't say illegal. They have legalisation and
Right.
various versions of things being illegal and or allowed for.
Australia, to me, is kind of the perfect case study. In my book, I pointed to it because you have basically all three different policies within the same borders of the country, and you have this legalized model where it's highly regulated, that essentially pushes out most of the population. You have a prohibition model, and you have a decriminalization model. And what I found really interesting was that in the decriminalization model, that was the area, when they tested different sex workers, that was the region that had the lowest STD or STI rates. And
Absolutely.
I think conventional wisdom would say that the legalized model, where there's these rigid testing standards, et cetera, would be the case. But that really rigid legalization system essentially pushed so much of the industry underground. And I can point to, there was a UN report that essentially came to the same conclusions with New Zealand. And I have the quote here that it was extremely low or non-existent, the STD rate in the sex industry there in New Zealand as well.
Yes, I think that was Professor Donovan's research, and it's it's no surprise, because if you make something legal, you do have a lot of illegal consequences, whereas decriminalisation, is the idea of repealing the legislations.
Yeah.
So sometimes people get confused and think legalisation is a progressive model, and it's not at all. It's for us in the context of this debate, that it is it's far more progressive to repeal legislation like brothel keeping, living on the earnings, procuring for sex work, and soliciting were the laws we had. And you would have similar things with different names, but all those activities that you need to do to organise to be a sex worker, a place to work from, a manager to hire you. In a legalised model, usually it's just a small part of the whole scenario that's favoured, and usually that's a kind of bigger business model. So, you get to have legal brothels, and the sex workers are checked, mandatory testing, and of course a lot of sex workers can't find work in brothels. They might be a little bit they might be too old, or just not fit into that kind of scenario and prefer to work for themselves. Well, in Melbourne, Australia, you have to go through a whole hoopla of registration to be able to work for yourself. So a lot of sex workers would not want to be doing that, and wouldn't qualify necessarily, and so they're outside of that system, and that makes it really tricky if you think about fronting up to have an STI checkup, and you might be a bit nervous about that, because the system might pick you up, if you like, and you certainly wouldn't declare that you're a sex worker if you're in breach of a regulation. So we don't recommend legalisation at all. It's a very restrictive model. Decriminalisation is our preferred by a country mile.
No, I fully agree. And I think, again, for a mostly American audience, a lot of this information is essentially, it's pretty foreign to most of us. But I'm also going to link to a study. It was printed in the Lancet, which is one of the top British medical journals. And their conclusion was that if you could expand decriminalization worldwide, that there would be anywhere from a 33 to a 44% decrease in STDs. And it's really for those same reasons. You can reach these workers. It really is kind of common sense, but that is after you examine and research the issue. I guess really one of the final points I wanted to touch upon, and you mentioned it earlier, is December 17th, the International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers. It's again this dichotomy here that was started back in 2003. Again, the same year when the U.S. is starting their anti-prostitution pledge. Your country takes a very different route. Every sort of real evidence-based research shows that in the countries where sex work is criminalized, sex workers face more violence. There was actually a study out of the UK, I think it was released this week, and it found that sex workers are 3 times more likely to face violence in the nations where it's criminalized. And again, you've touched upon it, but I was just kind of hoping you could expand a little bit more about what you've seen as far as violence against sex workers pre-decriminalization and post-decriminalization.
Yes, and I think it's I want to acknowledge International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, and it was Robin Few and the wonderful organisation of SWAP USA that coined this day. And I think the whole thing here in this country is that sex workers have a sense of entitlement now. Like, damn it, I deserve to be treated better. And right. I think that comes with confidence. It comes with the change in law. I am the same as you. I'm not in that criminal tier. You can't treat me like this. And so, equally, and when you're with, I'm not demonizing clients, but sometimes there are people who don't want to be a client, have no intention, and intend to have sex with you, or intend not to pay. And definitely when I was a sex worker and it was illegal, and you got to that point of negotiation, and of course in our country there was nothing illegal about the actions of the client. The client was allowed to pay for sex. I just wasn't allowed to ask for money for sex. So I felt very much on that back foot. Sometimes, when there were police raids and it was hypersensitive, I'd feel a little bit more disadvantaged. But, now, the sex workers, damn it, they're able to, and they describe situations like that where they might feel like the client's trying to have one over them, and they just say, well, shall I ring the police? I'll ring the police, shall I? And
right.
Operators of brothels who faced imprisonment, felt pretty powerless under the old laws as well. They could have been put in prison for 5 years if they admitted to knowing that they had sex workers working in their massage parlours, which is where a lot of us worked. And so, they can do all sorts of things to protect the sex workers now, that they can challenge people if they've been taking if they think they've been taking photographs, whereas before it would have been like, well, what can I do about it? I can't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't contact the police. So it's really a huge part of the benefit of decriminalisation, as well as the obvious stuff related to good health. Common sense stuff around health promotion.
Okay. Because I know that there's a book that came out recently. I was just kind of hoping that you could talk a little bit about that.
Karen Wilton, Caren Wilton, has written a book with stories of 9 or 11 sex workers in it. And the sex workers are reflecting on, working now, and some, like myself, are reflecting on having worked when it was illegal. And so it's a lovely collection, and it's really, there are men and women and non-binary, all sorts of sex workers are sharing experiences and reflecting. And sex work, as we know, doesn't define us. It's a part of us, part of what we do in, our busy lives. And so, it's quite interesting, different reflections. I would like to recommend people have a look at it. It's probably on Amazon. I can't say that for sure because I'm not the editor.
Once we finish up, I'll do my best. I'll get a link because I link to a lot of this stuff, and I'd like to link to any information about your organization as well. So if you would just, let the audience know a little bit more about your organization, if they want to follow you or keep in touch or whatever you'd like to let everyone know.
Fantastic. And we don't really apologize for our name because it's been our name. And so, our preferred terminology, of course, is sex work and sex worker. And we dob our hats to Carol Lee, Scarlet Harlot, who coined that. But nevertheless, our organisation is called the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. And I suppose one day a younger generation will get around to changing it. But we sometimes call ourselves a New Zealand Sex Workers Collective. And so we're interchangeable. And we are a organisation with, we have Facebook and we have a Twitter account, etc. And you can email us if you're working on projects and things that you need insight into, or you can do what we're doing now and you can talk. So we have 5 community centres across the country, and we have outreach, and sex workers just come in and flop in, clear their email and do all sorts of stuff and collect supplies. And we have doctors and nurses who come in and provide testing for us, and it's mostly anonymised, so you don't have to say that you're a sex worker. You don't have to give your real name. You can just be in your sex worker identity or any identity you like. So yeah, and we are pushing all the time to make sure conditions are good. We contract to government. We're also independent from government. We have our own funding that we generate as well.
Well, that's really interesting. And I really want to thank you for coming on the show. I really looked forward to this. I was really hoping to dispel some myths and just open people's minds to some new ideas. So again, I just want to thank you for coming on the show. And for everybody who's listening, I want to thank you for listening as well. Please share it on social media, give it a 5-star review. And I do ask, if you want to support the podcast, the best way to do that is to go out there and grab one of my books. It's a 3-book series called Rackets on the legalization of drugs and gambling and the decriminalization of prostitution. So again, I want to thank everybody, and until next time, bye-bye.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute.
You can have a license. Price is $250,000 plus a monthly payment of 5% of the gross of all 4 hotels in the store. Corleone.